Hello, everyone. It's Liz Grover from Jesus the Good Shepherd Church. I want to say hello to all of the children from our parish who are watching now, and also want to say hello to your families and tell you all how much we miss seeing you at Jesus Good Shepherd and how much we pray and look forward to hopefully seeing all of you really soon again back at the church and being together as a church family again. I thought it would be a good idea. We've been away from each other for, I don't know, 6 weeks or so now. So we're going to start something new. We're going to do a weekly video, just a short 15 to 20 minute video on a different saint each week. Could call it Summer with the Saints, or I guess it's not really summer yet, so maybe sort of summer with the saints. It strangely feels a bit like summer, even though the weather is still cool. We haven't been at school for a long time, right? So that kind of makes it feel a little bit like sort of summer. So with that said, I guess I'll launch right in. I picked a saint to talk to you for this first video today about Saint Joseph de Veuster, also known as Saint Damien. Now, why did I pick him? He's not a very super well-known saint, but he's a really interesting saint to me. And I think it'll be interesting to you too. I've been reading a lot about saints during this time when we've been at home a lot more and probably reading a lot more, maybe even watching a lot more TV, right? So I've got this book on saints, and it's really a kid's book on saints, but I guess I'm a little bit of a kid myself, and I enjoy reading it. It's written, wait, there it is. It's written on a very basic level, without a lot of big words, so it's easy reading for me. But I'm learning a lot about some saints who I had kind of forgotten about, who I learned about as a kid, and learning about some new saints who I didn't know so much about. So anyway, it's called Book of Saints by Amy Wellborn, and it's usually available on Amazon.com if parents, if you'd like to check it out for your own kids at home. The stories are short and simple and fun to read together as a family. So why Saint Damien? I chose him because, well, number one, it struck me that his feast day is coming up soon. It's coming up on May 10th, and believe it or not, it is almost May as I record this. And also because right now I've been thinking a lot about with this virus that we're all facing, and I hope that you are all staying healthy and well during this time. I've been thinking a lot about the helpers, the people who are working in the hospitals, not just taking care of the patients, but cleaning the rooms and providing the food, and all the techs and doctors and nurses who put themselves at risk every day by taking care of very sick people who need their help, and how heroic that is, and how Christ-like that is, right? Jesus put himself on the line for us and died for all of us. He took on a lot, and I think that these healthcare workers really are heroic. So with that said, of course, I lost my place in my book here. I'm going to talk to you all about Saint Damien today as soon as I find him. Before I do that, I will do a little quick geography lesson. Where are you, Saint Damien? Long dramatic pause. I'm going to find him. Oh, that's because I'm looking for him under Saint Damien instead of Saint Joseph. There he is. Okay, page 265. So here's the geography lesson. This saint was born in a country called Belgium. And if you know your geography, you will know that Belgium is pretty far away from where we live in Maryland in the United States of America. So here's us. See my globe? Here's the United States of America. There's New York. Let's come down a little bit. So we're like right down here in the United States. And then here's this big old ocean on my globe, and we go all the way across. North of France is Belgium here in Europe. So he was born there, but then he ended up traveling by boat all the way down past the tip of South America. See the tip of South America? And then back up through the Pacific Ocean all the way over here to these islands over here called Hawaii. They're called Hawaii now, but back then they weren't called Hawaii. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that. But he traveled a long way. And with that said, I'll start reading about Saint Joseph de Veuster. Another neat thing about this saint, he's kind of a recent saint. He didn't become a saint until 11 years ago in 2009. Pope Benedict canonized him. And we'll hear more about that too. So, Saint Joseph de Veuster, who was born in 1840 and died in 1889. So he was born about 180 years ago. Love is the most wonderful thing in the world, isn't it? How do you know it's wonderful? Think about these things. A hug from your mom or dad, a big kiss from your little sister, a long talk with a good friend who understands. All of these things come from loving hearts. Love certainly is wonderful, but it's also risky and dangerous. And love, believe it or not, can hurt more than anything. Think about how disappointed your parents are when you do something bad. If they didn't love you, they wouldn't be disappointed because they wouldn't care about you or your actions. Think about how bad you feel when your little sister is awake all night, sick with a fever and crying. You're sad, and not just because you're not getting any sleep either. You're sad because she's hurting and you can't do much to stop the hurt. If you didn't care, if you didn't love her, her cries wouldn't bother you in the same way. Yes, loving is a happy choice, but it's also a risk. When we love, we're choosing to care. And when people we care about are hurting, we hurt too. That's love. It's a choice we make every single day. And for most of us, the little hurts that loving brings don't last very long. St. Joseph de Veuster made a choice to love too, but his choice was more serious than anything most of us can imagine. He chose to love, and he knew that his choice would bring him deep personal pain. In fact, he knew that the love he chose would bring him more than pain, it would bring him death. Joseph de Veuster chose to love people who suffered from something called leprosy. Nowadays, leprosy, also known as Hansen's disease, is curable. But it was not curable in the 19th century when Joseph was alive. Back then, it killed people. It was a death sentence to be diagnosed with leprosy. Once a person was diagnosed with leprosy, he or she was sure to die within a few years. Joseph knew this, but he chose to love the lepers anyway. As I said before, Joseph was born in a country called Belgium. After he had completed his studies for the priesthood, he took the name Father Damien. He likely took that name in recognition of an earlier saint in the Catholic Church who went by the name Damien, who was a martyr in the 4th century. So then he was chosen for a special mission. He was chosen to go to Hawaii. Now, nowadays, if you say go to Hawaii, that's kind of an exciting thing because it's this beautiful place with all these beautiful islands. But his assignment was a little different, and we'll hear more about that. In those days, Hawaii was not yet part of the United States. So here's a little more history and geography for you boys and girls. Hawaii didn't become part of the United States until the year 1959, when it was our 50th state that joined our country. Back then, though, it was an independent country with kind of a funny name. It was called the Sandwich Islands. The islands were ruled by a king and a queen. Many foreigners lived there, including many Catholic priests and sisters who ran schools and helped the poor and the sick. That's what Damien traveled across 2 oceans to do. He went across the Atlantic Ocean. Remember I showed you down around the very tip of South Africa and up into the Pacific Ocean to Hawaii, because back then you couldn't get on an airplane and go from Belgium to Hawaii. The airplane hadn't been invented yet. So it was a very long trip by boat for him to get from Belgium to Hawaii. A few years after he arrived, Damien heard about a terrible situation on one of the islands in Hawaii. There were people living with leprosy in Hawaii. The rulers of the islands were afraid that the leprosy would spread, so they set aside part of one island for the lepers. If you were discovered to be sick with leprosy, you were put on a ship and sent to this island called Molokai. The island is still there today, and you can visit it. But back then, if you had leprosy and you were sent to Molokai, you didn't have a choice. You had to go. Believe it or not, the rulers of Hawaii sent lepers to Molokai with not much more than the clothes that they were wearing on their backs. There were no doctors there at Molokai to help these sick people. Ships would come in and drop off supplies for the lepers, but only occasionally, and it was never enough to meet their needs. The lepers lived in extreme, desperate poverty. They were poor. They had no one to help them or take care of them as their sickness got worse and worse until they died. Father Damien heard about the lepers on Molokai, and it didn't take him any time to decide that he would go there and take care of them. He would go and help them. So, what did that mean for Father Damien? Leprosy is spread through touch and through the air. When people have leprosy, their fingers, toes, and noses can be eaten away by the disease. It is very painful and it's a very awful disease. So thank goodness it's curable today, but back then it was not. Father Damien knew all this. He knew that if he went to live with the lepers, he would die from leprosy himself. He knew it. But he went anyway. Remember, we talked at the beginning about how loving can be very difficult and dangerous? His choice to love, he knew, was going to end his life. But he went anyway. The lepers needed his help. They needed God's love to give them strength in their suffering and in their death. They needed to live in peace and dignity while they could. If we hear about someone in need and we can help, how can we say no? So when Father Damien arrived at the island, he found a terrible sight. The lepers were living in filthy, dirty conditions. They had no fresh water. They were living in these small huts, and they had very little healthy food to eat. Of course, they had no bandages for their wounds. They had nothing to take their minds off their misery. Father Damien went right to work, though. He was a strong man full of energy and used to doing hard work. All by himself, he started building better homes for these sick people. He built a chapel so that they would have a place to come together and pray to God. And he taught the lepers how to plant gardens for fresh food. He was so busy that for the first few weeks, he didn't even bother to build himself a home. He slept under the wide, spreading branches of a big tree. Within months, the life of lepers changed. Yes, they were still sick. Father Damien had to perform one funeral every day. But something important had happened. From the beginning, Father Damien had been determined to love the lepers. He wouldn't be afraid, as other people were, to be close to them or to touch them. He would share meals with them and be their friends. Through his love, Father Damien taught the lepers that they were God's children. He taught them that they had dignity and that they could live with dignity. The lepers began to take pride in their settlement. Father Damien formed a choir that sang beautifully at all the masses. He taught them how to play all kinds of donated musical instruments, and they painted the chapel together in bright, beautiful colors. Father Damien convinced the government to send regular shipments of food and building supplies. And every day, since there were no doctors or nurses at the settlement, Father Damien spent his mornings washing the lepers' sores and bandaging their wounds. If a patient needed to have part of his or her body amputated, Father Damien did that too. So it's no wonder that one Sunday, after being on the island a few years, Father Damien began his homily in a new way. So if we remember what a homily is, children, during Mass, we have the two main parts of the Mass, the Liturgy of the Word and the Liturgy of the Eucharist. The Liturgy of the Word is where we hear from the Bible, God's love letter to us. We hear God's Word. And after we hear the first reading and the responsorial psalm and the second reading and the gospel from either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, the priest gives his message about what's the meaning of all those readings. The homily comes from a word in Greek that means discussion. So at all of our masses, we have a homily, right? And so it's no wonder that one Sunday, after he'd been on the island for a few years, Father Damien began his homily at Mass in a new and unusual way. He said, slowly and carefully, so that everyone there would understand, we lepers. He was telling them he was now one of them. He had the disease now. He had leprosy. Father Damien died 4 years later. He suffered the way anyone with leprosy suffered, and his body showed the same wounds. He worked until almost the very end of his life. When he could no longer leave his hut, his friends on the island would gather around the windows and doors of his hut, singing softly to him and giving him the same kind of comfort he had tried to give them for so many years. Jesus loved and kept loving, even though he knew it would bring his body suffering and pain. Father Damien loved this way too, just like Jesus. He freely loved without thinking twice about it, and he gave of himself. Also, we learn in class a lot about the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, and he's a perfect example. Father Damien, or Saint Damien, I should say, is a perfect example of living these works of mercy every day. He fed the hungry. He clothed them. He gave them drink. He buried the dead. He was there, being the hands and feet of Christ out there in the world. He wasn't just talking about it. He was doing it, and he was putting himself on the line. So, St. Joseph de Veuster helped others even though he knew that he would lose his life as a result of it. So here's a question for us, I guess, boys and girls. When you think about helping others, do you stop and count the cost, or do you just step up and help? So as we think about the people who are out there doing so much right now to help others, caregivers and our hospital workers, doctors and nurses, we can pray for St. Joseph de Veuster's, for his intercession, for him to intercede on behalf of these people, to give them strength, to give them courage, to give them hope, to feed them spiritually. And we can pray for him to help and work on their behalf. I hope you enjoyed learning about St. Joseph or St. Damien. His feast day is coming up. I'm going to post some resources about him, moms and dads, if your child was really interested and liked learning about this particular saint.